we'll have Rajat Vasudeva Murthy, who's going to present next. Rajat, while you set up your PowerPoint, I'll just quickly introduce you. Dr. Vasudeva Murthy is an electronics engineer by training and is passionate about Indian knowledge systems with a keen interest in language, philosophy, and history of science. He has obtained his BE from RV College of Engineering and PhD from Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. He's also worked as a researcher at Pennsylvania State University, State College USA for a year, and also at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden, for about 6 months. He's currently serving as an assistant professor in the Department of Electronics and Communication Engineering at BMS College of Engineering, Bengaluru, and takes special interest in propagating Indian intellectual heritage among engineering students through the AICTE Student Induction Program. So Rajat is today going to talk to us about, present to us, his topic is Buddhism as a Revolutionary Movement, a Critique of Western Indology. Over to you, Rajat.
Thank you so much, Meg, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks to Hariji and Nagaraji for this opportunity. And good evening to all the participants. All right, so this is the outline of my talk. I will present the motivation, which is rather personal, and just trace the evolution of early Buddhism, and talk a little bit about Pollock's views, how the distortions come about, maybe answer them briefly, and then finally conclude. So as I said, this is a personal kind of a motivation. So, I am very much interested in understanding India, especially the history aspect. So one term which we hear is itihasa. So many a times we are not sure whether that should be translated as history or historiography. And many people accuse that Indians do not have a proper discipline of history like how the Europeans have it, and so on and so forth. So that is something which I'm very keenly interested in. And another thing, like Hariji mentioned in the introduction to this conference, with all the Western Indologists coming in, they're messing up and distorting the history, the way it is presented, and also the chronology as well. So that is something which I'm kind of interested in. And there is a lot of contribution which has been done to various branches of science and philosophy from this land, which has a very long history and tradition. And that is somehow not very well represented, is my feeling. And therefore, we want to really understand it. And here is one quote I picked up from Max Muller in his book, History of Ancient Sanskrit Literature. He says that the inward life of the soul has so completely absorbed all the practical faculties of a whole people, so much so that India has no place in the political history of the world. But looking at what Pollock has been writing, he's trying to, present everything, mainly in the Sanskrit literature, from a political lens. So this is where I feel there is a stark contrast from something like, the statement from Max Muller. Okay, so quickly, a brief description of how Buddhism evolved in the early days post-Buddha. So the main important things which we hear is that once Buddha attained his Mahaparinirvana, he had established a Sangha, which had a lot of upasakas where they had formed the Sangha, but it seems that he had not created one particular leader who will take it forward post him. So that is when there was one particular person called Mahakassapa. He was being identified as a leader, and then there was a council under his leadership, which happened immediately after the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha, and it's said to have happened at Rajagriha. And as we know today, in the Pali canon, there are three Tripitakas, and they were beginning to be written down. Till then, it is said to be oral, and then they were kind of discussing them and then putting them down. And about 100 years after the first council, the second Buddhist council is going to be held, and this is during the reign of Kalashoka. And here, there is some disagreement, and the Sangha splits into the Eastern and Western groups. And even the third Pitaka here starts to take shape. And then finally, the third Buddhist council happens at two different places, right? Because there was a split in the Sangha towards the end of the second Buddhist council. One of them happens in the eastern side at Pataliputra under Ashoka's reign. Another happens in the western region at Jalandhar or Jalandhar under Kanishka's reign. And going forward, we have seen that in the second Buddhist council itself, there is a split, right, into two. And then over time, the Buddhist Sangha continues to split and has as many as 18 subgroups. Okay, so coming to the philosophy of Buddhism, so one of the things that is, when you contrast the Vedic religion or what we call Hinduism with Buddhism, one thing which people say is, although you have the Vedas, based on the Vedas, you have so many philosophies. You have Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Yoga, right, Purva Mimamsa, Uttara Mimamsa, and so on. And although there are certain commonalities in the sense that all of them accept Veda as a pramana, there is also differences. Okay, but that is kind of understandable, you could say, because there are so many seers who have given out so many different mantras which are collected in different Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads, and so on. But here, what do we see in Buddhism, right? If you look at the philosophy of Buddhism, although it is said to come from one person, right, we see all various, what shall we say, various hues of philosophies, right? On one hand, you have Sarvastivada. On the other hand, you have Shunyavada, which is like exactly opposite, 180-degree opposite of one another. And you also have Vijnanavada, right? And then you also have something known as Vaibhashika, right? Typically, Sarvastivada is put under Sautrantika, Vijnanavada under Yogachara, and Shunyavada under Madhyamika. But here, what I'm trying to stress upon is, although this, shall we say, religion called Buddhism comes from one person, or is said to come from one person, we see that there is a huge spectrum of philosophies, right, which are completely, opposite to one another, coming from that same person or same, tradition. So this makes us ask the question: what did the Buddha really say then, right? So one thing which everybody agrees is that he spoke about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and he also propagated the middle path between extreme self-indulgence in sense pleasures and extreme self-mortification or extreme asceticism, which he did, in fact, in his earlier life as well. Okay, but are these really unique to Buddhism, something revolutionary, right? So these things, if you just look at the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads, you will find that these things are already there. And I just get the question: was this, how could Buddha not have known this, or how could he not have come across this, right? He could be just paraphrasing whatever he had already come across, which was already probably mainstream, at least in the case of Buddha himself being an elite person. And in this context, Mysore Hiriyana opines that in the Buddhist canonical literature, which is available today, right, what we call as the Tripitakas, although it is said to be uttered by the Buddha, but there is no real means of knowing which portions were uttered by Buddha and which portions, got accreted later on. Because just now we discussed that the Tripitakas were actually settled a few hundred years, maybe 100 to 200 to 300 years after the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha. And Mukherjee opines that Buddha kind of presented a path to salvation. He preached it unto all, but he left the nature of ultimate reality an open question. And that is one of the reasons why they argue that you see this whole gamut of philosophies, which is ranging from all hues to go under the name of Buddhism. All right, so just another quick discussion comparing the Buddhism and the Vedic religion. So like I said, the main difference is that, the Veda did not have one particular person as a founder or one who propagated the Veda, right? We have hundreds of rishis, right? Starting all the way from the Samhita, Aranyaka, Brahmana, and Upanishad, we come across various rishis as mantra drashtaras. That is the main difference. But then there are a lot of commonalities, right? So there is the karma niyati, which is a Vedic concept, which is also accepted in Buddhism, and which is, of course, closely tied with the concept of Punarjanma. And there is also this criticism of blind ritualism. If you look at the Upanishads, even in the Bhagavad Gita, right, this blind ritualism is heavily criticized. Okay, so that is why I call it as a commonality, although I'm comparing with Veda. And so the differences will be that many people say that, Buddhists, we don't know really whether Buddha, in fact, decried the validity of Veda as a Shabda Pramana, but at least it is said that at least the later Buddhists, they were not ready to accept Veda as a Pramana. And so that I call as a difference between Vedic religion and Buddhism. And while Upanishadic learning, it is said that it was not given to all, but the message of the Buddha is said to be given in plain language and is said to be available to all. Okay. But we see also, if you look at it a little historically, we find that there are a few limitations of Buddhism, as was already pointed to by some of the earlier speakers. Buddhism happened to thrive under royal patronage and wealthy merchants, right? Even though the poor people who wanted to, they were, given the opportunity to serve. At least in that way, they were able to, serve the Buddhist Sangha. But it turned out that looks like they had a weak hold on the masses, right? So we can maybe look at this point that once the invasions happened from the western side, the uh, the places which we today call as Afghanistan and Pakistan, where uh, the concentration of Buddhists was larger, en masse conversions happened there. Okay, so therefore, I say that Buddhism had a weaker hold on the masses, so that it could not withstand that invasion from foreign invasions. And also, Buddhism, there is a sense that once you follow the Buddha, join the Sangha, you are kind of divorced from this family life and you live in this Sangha, right? So therefore, there is, I feel, an absence of reconciliation between the life of a householder and that of a spiritual aspirant, whereas this is very well brought out in the Gita and also in the Upanishads. Although the Upanishads highlight the other spiritual aspirants, at least in the Gita, this is brought out very, very well. Okay, so with that brief introduction, now I will step into what is known as axial theory. It's a very kind of, shall we say, old and very crude theory, but somehow Pollock still continues to use them. And it is said to be propounded by Jaspers, right, almost 70 years ago. He says that this axial age occurs at certain points in history where there is a capacity of human beings to reflect upon and to give expression to an image of the world as having the potential of being different from what it was perceived to be here and now. But it's very, very interesting and for me unfulfilling, in the sense that they do not even talk about the epistemological reasons for such a scenario, right? So that is very much lacking here. And another point here is that there is going to be a genesis of people who feel themselves a unity with a common language, common culture, common body of myths. Okay, and then Jasper says that in this period there will be a transition from mythos or mythology, what you can say, to logos, which is more logical. And they say that here it's going to be a reflexive phenomenon, and also there is going to be historical consciousness. So note this word historical. Okay, and Jaspers locates it in the middle of first millennium BC. Okay, so what Pollock does is he takes some of these points. Okay, so he takes this revolution, reflexivity, historicity, right, and then he is trying to project that onto Buddhism. Okay, but very interestingly, again, he's going to cherry pick, right? So there was the notion of a common people getting formed in the axial age, but that is being rejected by Pollock here. This is very funny. And not that he adds any epistemological reasons why such an axial age should occur. There are other people, other scholars like Eisenstadt and Heistermann, who kind of propose other periods for this axial age. Okay, so for example, Eisenstadt says the later Vedic thought, he gives it an axial status. Okay, and the gap between the Vedic revelation and it being turned into rituals or the various yajnas, that is being called as an axial turning point by Heistermann, but that strangely is rejected by Pollock. But he just wants to cherry pick some of the aspects of axial age and put it on Buddhism and call that as an axial age. So, few examples. What Pollock does is he takes Mimamsa, right, and compares it with Buddhism, and he says Mimamsa is going to emphasize on the authorlessness or the apaurushayattva of the Veda that you have on one side, and on the other side you have Buddha as the preacher and founder of this new religion, right? On the other hand, you have ahistoricity of the Veda, right, and pit it against Buddha being a historical person. Okay, so this is one, he's putting this as a wedge or as a difference and trying to highlight that this is the reason why he calls Buddhism as an axial age. And then he talks about social reform, right? So where he's going to, talk about the Buddhist Sangha. Buddha is going to preach, and then he's, encouraging people to convert to his doctrine, right? Whereas earlier in the Vedic society, what happens? People are just born into whichever family they are, into whichever philosophy they are, and they just go about it, right? Almost like automatons. But here, Buddha is coming around, and then he's, making people actualize. Okay, and then he's forming a community of upasakas. All right, so this couple of points I will come back to it later and then discuss them. And then he's also providing a transvaluation of some of the concepts which are held very important in the Vedic society, like yajna and atma. This also will come back, and also in the language. Okay. Yeah. So some of the points I'll briefly discuss here. So Mimamsa, one of the, shall we say, idiosyncrasies of Mimamsa is that they argue for the Apaurushayatva of the Vedas. It's a very, very interesting argument, although I don't have time to go through it in great detail. But one thing we have to notice that Apaurushayatva is not understood by all the darshanas in the same manner. Okay, so this is kind of, we can say, unique to Mimamsa. So this Apaurushayatva, Pollock translates as authorlessness. Okay, and he says that, Mimamsa claims that Veda does not have a human nor a divine author. Okay, so as I said, this is something very peculiar to Mimamsa because other darshanas have other views. Because in one of the Upanishads itself, it is said that Asya Mahato Bhutasya Nishvasitam. Okay, it is as though it's the very breath which is breathed out by that Mahabhuta is this Veda. Okay, and of course the Nyaya say that Veda is Paurushaya, only thing it's a divine origin. So what Pollock does is he kind of says that this particular, shall we say, idiosyncrasy or almost irrational idea is coming because the Mimamsa people are trying to counter the Buddhist. Okay, so this he says Mimamsa's reaction to Buddhist criticism of the Veda. But of course, this is not. Of course, we have to understand the chronology. If this is really the case, it doesn't seem to be, because if you look at Brahma Sutras, right, it seems that both the Brahma Sutras and the Jaimini Sutras, which are the Mimamsa Sutras, are found to be contemporary. And while we find discussion of Sankhya and Yoga in the Brahma Sutra, we don't find a direct discussion of the Bauddha and Jaina matas. So probably this is not the case, although we need more investigation. Okay, I guess in the interest of time, let me skip and go to the next one. Ahistoricity, yeah, so this is another thing. So in the Indian tradition, many of the Sanskrit texts, it is very, very hard to establish which came first, which came later, right? Even among the Valmiki, Ramayana and Vyasa Mahabharata itself, we have a huge, discussion and debate which came first, which came later, and so on. Okay, so but what Pollock is trying to say is that the Vedic corpus is trying to escape confinement in any spatio-temporal framework. It's very interesting how he gets this idea. But he says, on the contrary, Buddhist holy texts, they are very much, give a time, place, audience, and the speaker as well. Okay, and this is quite far from the truth, as we know very well, right? Inspired by the Hindu Puranas, the Buddhists, later Buddhists, they also want to bring their own Puranas. They want to create more deities like Avalokiteshvara and so on. You have the Buddhist Jataka tales inspired by the Ramayana and other Puranas and so on and so forth. Also, although nobody looks at Indian, at least the Vedic texts and the Sanskrit literature in a very historical manner, it can be done. Okay, some people do it, right? For example, R.S. Agarwala, he talks about India at the time of Panini. And he says that, Yajnavalkya, who comes in the Shatapada Brahmana, is slightly later compared to some of the earlier rishis. And of course, Talageri has done brilliant work, right? He studies the Rig Veda and establishes that certain mandalas are older than certain other mandalas. Okay. But, and as we just now saw, this assertion by Pollock is not entirely true, because the Tripitakas themselves, are formed only after a few centuries after the parinirvana of the Buddha. Okay, and what explains the divergence in the philosophies of Buddhism, right, which we just now discussed at the beginning of this presentation, right? All right, so coming to social reform very quickly, Agarwala points out that Panini talks about both the political as well as the religious Sangha, right? He talks about Ekadhina, monarchy, Ganadhina, which is a republic, and Nikaya is as a religious Sangha. And these are found to be common to all the Shramana sects. And the Shramana itself, the word Shramana and Brahmana both occur in the Panini Sutras themselves. And this Shramana includes Ajivikas, Anuvadins, and as well as the Jainas. All right, so here again, so this revolutionary point about Buddhism is not really true. Also, while these Shramana sects are said to be, very democratic, welcoming everybody, whereas Veda was kind of restricted to certain people, we have one particular adhikarana in the Brahma Sutra, which is called Apashudra Adhikarana, right? Which says that although everybody does not have adhikara for Veda, there is adhikara for everybody for Vedanta. And Shankaracharya in his Bhashya, in this particular section, he explicitly gives the example of Vidura and Dharmavyadha, who were not supposedly having adhikara for Veda, but they had the adhikara for Vedanta, and they are, they preach it very well. So they are demonstrated as examples of wise men who still didn't have adhikara for Veda, but they had for Vedanta. And some people also say that influenced by this is when women and people of so-called lower caste were also admitted into the Buddhist Sangha later. All right, and then so Pollock also says that this created a social stir in the Vedic society, while the role was earlier fixed by birth. But here, Buddha, who's supposed to be a Kshatriya person, he's coming and doing the preaching, which was earlier reserved only for Brahmanas. But we find that is not really true, because even if you look at the Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka and the Chandogya, we find that kings, right, who are supposed to be the Kshatriya, Ajatashatru and Pravahana Javali, they are going to teach Brahma Vidya to so-called Brahmanas, Gargya, Balaki, and Gautama. So Buddha and Mahavira are not the only Kshatriyas who are going to teach. We do have such examples in the Upanishads themselves. Okay, so very quickly going on to Yajna and Atma, Pollock brings up this Kutadanta Sutta, where a Brahmana is dissuaded from doing a blood sacrifice, right? And he's recommended to go for non-violence in a non-coercion manner. Okay, but such an idea we find in the Mahanarayana Upanishad itself. It says, especially for a person who is in the Aranyaka, right, who is a forest dweller, right, in the Vanaprastha, he says, Tasyaivam vidusho yajnaha, yajnasya atma yajamana shraddha patni, okay, kama ajyam manyush pashu, etc. So the animal, so-called to be sacrificed, is his own anger, okay, manyush pashu. And of course, in the Gita itself, we have the famous shloka, Dravya Yajnastapo Yajna Yoga Yajnastathaparam, etc. And very interestingly, in the case of Atma, so Pollock says that, by saying that there is no Atma, this Buddha is cancelling all the Upanishadic thought. Okay, but Bhattacharya very nicely points out that be it Buddha or be it the Upanishads, their main intention is to root out desire. Okay, so Upanishads, while they say that both the subject, that is the person who is the desirer, and the object of the desire are not separate from Brahman, that is the approach taken by Upanishads, whereas Buddha takes the opposite approach of saying that neither the subject nor the object of desire really exist. But their final objective is the same. But here, in the case of Buddha, the question arises, they also talk about this karma niyati, right? So the karma concept is there, doctrine of karma. So if the subject is also doesn't really exist, then how does this karma operate? So that is one question which I have, and I've not yet found a satisfactory answer for that.
5-minute prompt.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, just a quick note on the language. So in most of Indian languages, which is especially true in the case of Tamil, we have this concept of diglossia, right? So there is one language which you use for formal communication, literary communication, and there is another which you use informally for speech. Okay, so if you look at certain Sanskrit literature, right, it could be the place of Bhasa or Shudraka, we find that they use Sanskrit for certain characters which they want to project as educated, and certain other language, right, the Prakrits, for those characters which they want to depict as uneducated. But here, that is turned into a big issue here by Pollack. He's saying that early Buddhists reject the use of Sanskrit due to the language theory which the Mimamsakas give. So, of course, the Mimamsakas have a strange theory, Shabda Nityatvam and so on. But Pollack is saying that Buddhists are going to reject Sanskrit due to that particular esoteric theory, which is not very convincing. But historically, the Buddhists, especially the Mahayana Buddhists, right, they come back to Sanskrit. We have a huge body of literature in Sanskrit about Buddhism. And so Pollack wonders, why did that happen? Once the early Buddhists reject Sanskrit, why did they come back? And he comes up with a few reasons, and then he says none of them are satisfactory. Okay, but what I feel is my take on this is that it is Sanskrit is going to be the formal register, right? And Prakrits, or the local tongue, or the various dialects which are spoken in a given area, they are the spoken tongue of the people. So therefore, whenever you use that local vernacular to communicate, there is always a certain loss in information which happens. Okay, so whenever you want to communicate some technical terms like maybe philosophy, people usually prefer Sanskrit. Okay, whereas if you are doing a normal conversation, the local vernaculars are very good. Fine enough. All right, and Pollack also says that Buddhists use Sanskrit for the first time to compose non-Vedic literature. Okay, and therefore saying that earlier Sanskrit was just confined only to the Veda, but then later to develop Kavya and all, it is the Buddhist contribution, which it's not at all satisfactory. Yeah, and then there is this very interesting take on Buddhism by Max Miller. He says that kind of Buddhism is preparing Indians to get converted to Christianity, which I find very, very strange. And maybe this is the driving force why they are trying to paint Buddhism in a good light, which I don't go into this too much. Okay, so in conclusion, my main interest is to understand the correct history and at least get a better understanding of the chronology of various important events in the Indian civilization. In this context, just to mention some of the distortions which have been introduced in our understanding, I've presented some of the views of Pollack about Buddhism, and then discussed some responses to them. And it seems to me that the views expressed by Pollack are by carefully cherry picking certain points, right, which will only support his materialistic insinuations. He's not paying heed to the chronology, and he does not even take into account that there are so many different darshanas, right, both Vaidika and Avaidika, and he's not even going into many of the epistemological details, right, but just he's trying to, just paint a picture by just carefully cherry picking things. All right, and then acknowledgements. So the understanding out of which this presentation has been prepared is thanks to all these people, my gurus, Shri Phaniraj, Dr. Rama, Swami Paramarthananda, Swami Paramananda Bharati, Swami Paramasukhananda, and thanks to discussions with Krishnamurti, Gokul Muthu, and Dr. Mohan and Meg as well. Yeah, so with that, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rajat. Thank you very much.